And we're going. All right, we're recording. Cue the intro music. And of course, we want to welcome all of our audience, viewers and listeners. We're really glad that you're participating as an audience. And of course, we welcome your input and comments. If you see our show, just let us know you saw the show. Let us know what your thoughts are. Our topic today is going to be representative democracy and constitutional republic, basically the form and function of our nation's government and its history of enfranchisement. And yeah, Mary, you want to talk to us a little bit why we're talking about constitutional republics and democracy today?
Yeah, there seems to be, obviously this program is pro-democracy. And obviously there's some general limitations. We certainly don't want people voting 12 times a year or 25 times a year on laws that are being passed at the state and federal level. And therefore, we elect legislators to help do that, and they can focus on the content of these laws and the validity and so forth. But in general, as a pro-democracy group, I am always concerned or perplexed when I see things on social media from people like Diane Rich, as an example. And she's posted, "We are a constitutional republic. We are not a democracy. People need to understand that." I thought, yeah, let's understand what she's trying to talk about.
Yeah, let's understand that. Yeah, and so yeah, there is this kind of disinformation narrative among far that creates a false dichotomy between a constitutional republic and our democracy. And they leverage what you described. They leverage the direct democracy, which means that every single person is involved in all decisions of the state, as a way of creating a bit of smoke and mirrors to deny that we're a democracy altogether, when we are in fact both a constitutional republic and a representative democracy. And that, in order to understand that, we have to understand what we're talking about when we talk about what a republic is and what a democracy is. First of all, a republic is a state whose locus of power rests with the public, rather than with, say, a head of state like a king. And republicanism as a movement began in the 18th century mainly, and the American Revolution was one of the first anti-monarchical revolutions. And we established, after that revolution, through our Constitution, we established a republic that meant that we don't have a king. We're not going to be a monarchy anymore. We don't have a noble aristocracy where people have, by birth, access to title and lands and wealth and things like that, and therefore political power. We have a constitution that creates a structure around which our government functions and has the force of law. But the mechanism by which the public can wield power in a republic is democracy. It's either going to be representative democracy or it's going to be direct democracy. And in our case, we have a representative democracy. That's the mechanism by which the public, which has the locus of power, government by the people, manages that power. We elect representatives who then go and sit in legislatures, and then make choices by voting themselves. So the determination of who actually is in the public, who actually gets to wield this democratic power, that's determined by our Constitution. Now, our Constitution determines who is enfranchised, how power is maintained within that public, and how power is prevented from becoming localized in a head of state or other non-public entity, such as a class, a political power, market institution, or religion. All of this is accomplished through our Constitution, which has the force of law over the states and over the government, and has also the ability to be changed by democracy. So we have this kind of, so what you in the false dichotomy is they'll say in a democracy, all of the power is with the people. And in a constitutional republic, all of the power is with the Constitution. That's a false dichotomy. We already know that we have a constitution that has the force of law, and we also know that the people have the power to change that constitution. So power is created when the people who wield that power have that power governed and guided by the structure that the Constitution provides. So we are a constitutional republic that in which the public wields power through democracy, through representative democracy. So that's a very easy explanation for why we have both terms as true for what our government is. It doesn't explain why we have this false dichotomy coming from the right. And to get into that, we have to look at the history of our country and the conflict and tensions that have been around this issue of who is the public, who among the people actually gets to wield that power, who is enfranchised. And so that's where we get into why are they telling this disinformation? Why are they giving this disinformation? Or why are they ill-informed by this disinformation and then spreading it? Because let's be honest, like people like Diane Rich probably aren't actively trying to perpetuate this disinformation. They probably are ill-informed and are just spreading it because they believe it, which is what happens when you have a disinformation campaign like this. So we're a constitutional republic. Our mechanism of public power is representative democracy. And the challenge that we're facing is the question and conflict over who gets to be enfranchised as members of the public. And that has changed over our history. It hasn't always been what it is today. And over our history, we've seen transition from a very narrow rule of who counts as the enfranchised public, people who can vote, people who can participate in government, to a much broader definition, and including constitutional amendments that enforced that. Because when our Constitution was ratified in 1789, the Constitution granted the states the power to set voting requirements. So the Constitution itself didn't set any voting requirements and say this is who can vote and this is who can't. It said the states have that power, the states can determine that. And the individual states had different rules about that. So you had states like New Jersey that enfranchised all of the free men in the state, regardless of race. And it also enfranchised unmarried women and widowed women of all races. That was New Jersey. So some of the states allowed Black males to vote. New Jersey also enfranchised widowed and unmarried women. But most of the states, most of them, limited the vote to property owning white males, which was about 6% of the population. The main state to remove that requirement actually removed it at about the same time that they ratified the Constitution. That was Georgia. Georgia removed its property requirement in 1789.
Huh.
And then also you have to remember back then we had another conflict at play too. Not only the conflict over who's enfranchised as the right to vote, but also this relationship between the people and the government. But we also had a conflict over the relationship between the states and the federal government. And the way that the framers of the Constitution helped resolve that tension was we had two legislatures, one which was the U.S. House of Representatives, which was democratically elected on the basis of population representation. And then we also have the Senate, which every state has two senators. Irrespective of how big those states are, they all have two senators. And back then, and it wasn't changed until 1913, so just barely over 100 years ago. Back then, senators were chosen by state legislators. Now, they're voted before by the public.
Right.
But
Right.
back then, when our Constitution first came
Right.
out, senators, the entire U.S. Senate was chosen by state legislators. So that gave states a lot more control and created barriers for of access to power for people who might be more interested in a more direct democratic kind of system. So that favored the states and helped limit some of the powers of the federal government. And so that early conflict between the role of the states and the role of the federal government was managed by having those two legislators, one which was democratically elected by the people, and in that way gave people more direct influence on federal government affairs, and one that was elected by the states and gave states a little bit more influence and reins over the federal government. So that was when we first formed as a constitutional republic. That's what we looked like. And over the next few decades, more states began joining the union. And we saw this tension between who gets to vote and who doesn't start to play out. New states joined, voting rights were regularly updated and altered by the states. Generally, the changes that were made in this period of time disenfranchised women and people of color in the few states that had permitted them to vote. But it also simultaneously removed property requirements for white male voters, enfranchising more of them. So what you had these two strands of political movement in conflict with each other. You had liberalism, which had been spreading across Western civilization, this idea of universal equality. Liberalism is the ideology that we hear in the Declaration of Independence. All people are created equal, and all should have the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And added to liberalism is the right to property as well. And against liberalism was this older model of ideology that was shaped by monarchialism and the aristocracy, and the idea that some people were either divinely or otherwise born better than others and had better characteristics that afforded them the right to property, the right to political power and authority over the state. And these two trends were in tension in the United States as a post-revolutionary society that still had elements that had inherited the cultural values of the monarchical system that came before it. So the sacrifice of property requirements that favored that older, more conservative approach to governance, though that started to give way. So the people who weren't property holders, people who weren't part of the old landed aristocracy or any of that, those people could start voting. But while that liberal kind of movement to remove property requirements from voting was going full steam ahead, the backlash was then we need to somehow protect or preserve this power that's starting to get spread around the public a lot more. We need to preserve it for our kind of people. And so that meant disenfranchising women, disenfranchising people of color in those few states that permitted it. And of course, that also meant that Native Americans were being disenfranchised as well.
So one of the things I'd want to interject here, especially the Constitution was not crafted by people with divine powers or knowledge, and they were in fact, James Madison, I think it's in the Federalists number 10, he worries that if we empower the people too much, that the plutocrats will lose their stronghold. He writes in there, we have to protect the minority of the opulent from the majority. And so we see all these little checks and balances put in there, like the Electoral College, for
Yeah, we
example.
absolutely see from the very get-go that the framers of the Constitution also have their own personal interest invested in the formation of this nation, and they're all property owners. So one of the things that, of course, is a major concern for them as you see this revolutionary movement of republicanism start to spread is how are we going to keep what's ours? And so the property rights and the issue of property rights is a significantly protected portion of our nation's founding documents and structure.
Well, the whole purpose for coming to the new land, the new world, was to plunder its resources for the benefit of the king. And eventually they tired of doing it for the king and they wanted to do it for themselves. But the Commerce Clause, all those things are all designed for the extraction and profit from resources.
Right.
And if historically, if you go back, there was nothing noble about what was going on. George Washington, even the Articles of Confederation, certainly had a lot of flaws, but they were somewhat democratic compared to, in fact, it was George Washington who owned like 60,000 acres in 5 different provinces, or maybe it was even more than that. He was a big landowner. And he got frustrated because in moving goods from Maryland to Virginia or wherever, he was passing through territories that had entirely different rules. And he was pushing for this centralized form of government simply to make it easier for him to
Yeah.
he and his friends
So,
too.
so yeah, there were these two countercurrents in our culture, in our society. The one that was trying to preserve the interests of the wealthy landowning class, and the other that was trying to expand enfranchisement of the broader public. And those two countercurrents in tension are why we had both simultaneously the reduction of the property requirement to vote, which was part of this more Republican liberal current of democracy, and this countercurrent that was trying to preserve the interests of the wealthy landowners maintained these voting restrictions that disenfranchise women, disenfranchise people of color. These two countercurrents of political interest were the early tensions of our country, and they continued up until the Republican Revolution, which I'm using the term Republican Revolution, but what I mean is the Civil War.
Right.
The Civil War is this moment in our history where, after the growth of liberalism in the United States and the enfranchisement of more and more people, you start to see the abolitionist movement growing, and you start to see eventually you see the creation of a new populist party, the Republican Party, that's the champion of these Republican ideas of everyone's equal, everyone should have access to power, and everyone should be able to participate in government. And that rise of republicanism as the dominant ideology and influence in our nation's society and government, of course, led to a major conflict between those who were trying to reserve power in the hands of the wealthy landowning elite and those who were trying to spread power among the common people. The Civil War is fought over that ideological difference. Of course, the main issue of property ownership that the reactionaries are actually trying to protect is the ownership of people, enslaved people.
Right.
And so slavery, of course, is the central conflict over which they're fighting, but the ideological conflict is republicanism ascendant and this kind of elitism of the old monarchical and then the heritage of the old monarchical system and the aristocracy, these wealthy landowners. That's in tension and that's in conflict. And the Republicans won the Civil War. And immediately after the Civil War, you see this rapid enfranchisement of people of all races. So you have the 15th Amendment ratifies, which prevents states from denying. So remember, states still have the power to determine who gets to vote in their elections. So the 15th Amendment doesn't give people of color the right to vote. What it does is it denies the states from the power to deny people the right to vote on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So that's basically restricting the state's power in terms of determining who has the right to vote. Of course, the states then, those states that were reactionary and wanted to continue to restrict voting access found other ways of restricting the vote with the intention of keeping people of color from voting. They just found other ways that didn't explicitly name race as the basis. So that you see the rise of the Jim Crow laws after Reconstruction. And they're restricting the vote through things like wealth taxes, poll taxes, grandfather clause, reading requirements, all these kinds of other ways in which they restricted access to vote to Black people and other persons of color. And you also then see a lot of violence around voting in the South, particularly to prevent Black people from voting. So you see the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and militia kinds of movements, white supremacist movements, and participation, of course, in these reactionary governments that were elected in the South. And so even though the 15th Amendment is intended to give everyone, regardless of race, every male, regardless of race, the right to vote, the reactionaries really responded I can't even use the word. They responded very strongly against that. And you see this rising reactionary movement in the 1870s through into the early 20th century that disenfranchises people of color almost completely in the South.
Right.
But, and also Native Americans were entirely disenfranchised during that period, not only denied the right to vote, but denied citizenship in the United States as well. And that was that ran concurrent with our genocidal wars against them. So the U.S. is waging, post-Civil War, the U.S. is waging many genocidal wars against the Native population, displacing them and destroying them. And so that's part of this massive reactionary movement to try to curb and roll back all of these liberal influences in society. And the truth of the matter is, the Republicans were complicit in this. It wasn't just the Democrats. It wasn't just the old reactionary elite. Republicans participated in this while also, simultaneously working to try to enfranchise more and more of their people, which meant that you saw throughout the late 19th century and early 20th century, you saw states start to enfranchise women. And this went back and forth. So states would enfranchise women, and then a few years later, or a decade later, they would say, oh, never mind, and they would take the vote away again, only to have it reinstated a few years later. So this movement, this Republican movement, was always in tension and conflict with the reactionaries, and it was a struggle until 1920, when the 19th Amendment finally guarantees women the right to vote. Of course, in practice, the restrictions that disenfranchise men of color also disenfranchise women of color. So in 1920, the 19th Amendment pretty much effectively gave white women the right to vote, but didn't extend that beyond that. And of course, in 1924, Native Americans were granted citizenship and the right to vote that was called the Indian Citizenship Act. Reactionaries to that ignored it. So you had a number of Western states that, despite the fact that law gave Indian citizenship and the right to vote, many Western states continued to deny it, like South Dakota, and I believe Arizona or Nevada, and states like that. And in fact, the last state to remove its restrictions on Native Americans voting did so in 1970, like that recently. I want to say that was Colorado had a reservation that people on the reservation were denied the right to vote. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't still voting restrictions and barriers for Native Americans.
Sure.
There are. In
Sure.
fact, there's a residence address requirement in, I believe, North Dakota that is explicitly designed to keep natives on the reservation from being able to vote. So that's still happening. We're still in this kind of conflict and tension over who gets to participate in our democracy and who does not. In 1943, Chinese immigrants were finally allowed to become citizens. In 1952, all Americans of Asian descent were allowed the right to vote. And then we hit the 1960s. And the 1960s is the big moment. So we had this in the 1860s, we had this war over this Republican push for enfranchisement of all people. And in the 1960s, we see this resurgence of interest in enfranchisement and civil rights. And that coincides with this massive conflict that the United States is engaged in against communism. So you have these two competing interests, one which is trying to preserve wealth and capital, and one which is trying to enfranchise the common people regardless of wealth and power. In particular, one is trying to enfranchise people who've been denied that on the basis of race, despite the constitutional amendment that is supposed to prevent that. So in the 1960s, we see landmark Supreme Court rulings that entrench this equal representation model in our society, which means voting districts have to be approximately the same size in population, and therefore that allows for each person's vote to count the same as every other person's vote. Whereas if you have different sized districts, of course, some people's vote is going to count more than others, and that sort of thing. So that's a major change in our structure in the 1960s that moves us more towards a liberal democracy. And of course, you have the Voting Rights Act in 1965 that removes a lot of the voting restrictions that were imposed by Jim Crow laws in the South and protects the access to the vote for Black people. We saw the end of tax payment requirements, wealth requirements, and poll taxes, all of those kinds of other things that were designed to not only keep people of color from voting, but also keep poor people from voting. All of that stuff gets overturned and removed in the 1960s. And then eventually in 1971, the vote gets extended to people ages 18 to 21. So you see during this era, you see this massive expansion of civil rights and enfranchisement. Yeah, we see this growth of liberal democracy. More and more of the society is allowed to participate in government. The reactionaries who'd been trying to restrict this and trying to maintain segregation weren't happy with all of these changes. And so in the 1960s, you see this major shift in party allegiance by reactionary elements that tried to preserve racial segregationist policies and disenfranchisement of people of color. So people like Strom Thurmond.
Yeah.
And they were already ready to leave the party. They were all Democrats at the time, but they were already ready to leave the party because the Democratic Party had already begun to leave them behind. It had already started. So liberalism, republicanism had pretty much taken over the entire country, and it was ascendant. And the Democratic Party had started to give way to it back with the election of FDR and his New Deal. And so the New Deal coalition and the civil rights movement pretty much meant that these kinds of Southern conservative Democrats no longer felt at home in the Democratic Party. And the Republican Party had already been turning rightward since the end of the 19th century because they had become aligned with big business, especially at the end of the 19th century. And so the Republican Party, in its allegiance to big business, was opposed to the New Deal. And it was opposed to the liberal economic reforms during the Great Depression. And so there began to be this commonality between the Southern segregationist Democrats and these big business Republicans who were very conservative in economic policy. They started to see more common ground, while the liberal wing of the Republican Party started to see more common ground with the Democrats. So you had Republicans in New England states starting to align themselves with the New Deal and with FDR and with the Civil Rights Movement. And so they ended up jumping into the Democratic Party, and then the segregationists jumped into the Republican Party. And what we have since then is the party alignments that we have today. The Republican Party is this uneasy alliance of conservative liberals. I'm using that in the small L sense of the word.
Yeah.
Conservative liberals,
Right.
they have this idea of universal equality, but their conservatism comes from this fear of radicalism on the left, the idea that maybe that property rights might be abolished. So
Right.
conservative liberals are usually interested in protecting economic policies that preserve the capitalist market and property rights. So they have an uneasy alliance with the libertarians, and of course with the reactionaries who believe that some people are born better than others. So the segregationists, and they're the inheritors of that ideological framework of supremacy. So that's the GOP. This is really uneasy alliance. And right now what we see is the reactionaries are increasingly getting control over that party using the vehicle of religious populism. The Democrats on the other side are overwhelmingly a party of liberal Republicans. The universal equality thing, all of that. But in the last few decades, we've seen this growing movement towards democratic socialism, as well as increased numbers of radical leftists. So the Democrats tend to be forming an uneasy alliance with democratic socialists, but then they also, during elections, they also have oftentimes the unwilling support of radical leftists who hate them, but hate the Republicans more.
Yeah.
So we have, that's the structure we have now. And since the civil rights movement, we continue to see this kind of tension between access to voting and denial of access to voting. And the reactionaries are always trying to find loopholes with the laws that have expanded voting access. So the Civil Rights Act, of course, meant that you can't do poll taxes, you can't do Jim Crow laws in the way they used to be done. So what happened was the new disenfranchisement since then was the disenfranchisement of convicted felons. And so you see this rapid increase in criminalization of people of color, and this rapid increase in imprisonment as incarceration as a tool to disenfranchise voters. And so to the point where people of color and low-income people disproportionately make up our prison population, and our prison population has skyrocketed since that era. We have the largest prison population in the world. 1 in 5 incarcerated people in the world is incarcerated by the United States. And we also have the 6th highest rate of incarceration. This year, we have the 6th highest rate of incarceration in the world. In 2018, we were the highest. We had the highest rate of incarceration in the world.
Wow.
So this idea that we're a free society or a free country is constantly being challenged by this reactionary movement that's actually actively trying to keep people from having access to power and using any possible tool that they can, including incarceration and the disenfranchisement of felons, to do. Of course, over the last 3 decades, there have been efforts on the part of the liberals to enfranchise ex-convicts, and then reactionaries will find new ways to restrict voting access for people of color, indigenous people, poor people, and particularly in areas that have high voter turnout for the Democratic Party. And these efforts are combined with gerrymandering. So you see voter ID laws, gerrymandering, and other strategies to pretty much abrogate liberal democratic policies that are increasing the occurrences. And so the result is we see more and more as a result of reactionary policies, we see more and more instances of minority rule over government. Even though the Republican Party is diminishing in its membership and represents a small percentage, around 30% of the country, they hold outsized power. And that's it. That's the history of enfranchisement in our country in a nutshell. And that's the basis for this false dichotomy between constitutional republic and democracy. The idea is if you create this false dichotomy, then you can justify and mainstream these kinds of policies that disenfranchise people by saying, oh, but we're not a democracy anyway. We're a constitutional republic. So it's in our society's interest to keep certain kinds of people from having access to power because they're not people who have our constitutional republic's best interests in mind. And that's really what this false dichotomy is designed to do. And in particular, the interest is disenfranchising voters of color. It's directed at an ill-informed voter base that's conditioned by religious fundamentalism and conspiracy theory thinking to distrust the liberal movement as an effort to disenfranchise white and conservative voters. That's it. They think liberals are trying to keep white and conservative people from being able to vote. And that's just not true because that's not a liberal movement. Liberal is about making sure that everybody has access to power. And in that respect, the anti-democracy disinformation runs parallel to some of these other things that we see in that movement, like the white replacement theory, the conspiracy theory that that liberals are trying to replace white people with people of color, and also the myth that Christians are facing or about to face severe religious persecution in the U.S. and conspiracy theories around globalist control of the U.S. government. So this appeal to constitutional republic is intended to cast a far-right vision of a society that's justified in disenfranchising significant numbers of the population for the sake of preserving liberty or some cultural or traditional heritage that is somehow integral to the society's vitality.
So it's interesting to me in listening to this that I think a lot of the times, at least locally, when people are bantering these labels around, I don't think they really understand the term that they're using. At least it's or at least how we got to it historically. And when you look back on how the Constitution was formed, nobody granted the people holding these conventions any particular authority to start doing that. They just started doing that. And then they got local leaders to buy into the concept.
The states did have legislators that sent delegates to the Constitutional Convention.
They did, but they had to work them in over a period of time till all those different those conventions. And it's very similar, like locally there was this effort when the LNG terminal was going on. There was this effort by some local folks to privatize the tax money, the tax revenue that they were anticipating receiving from the LNG terminal. It was called the Community Enhancement Plan. And basically they did a very similar thing. Some local movers and shakers decided this was a good idea. They went and gave a pitch to the city councils and the county commission and said, let's buy into this, so that they could privatize tax dollars. And they were going to put it into a foundation and do all these wonderful things.
Well, certainly, yeah, the privatization of public funds and basically public resources is part of this kind of reactionary and elitist approach to governance that tries to take basically public common power and restrict in the hands and control of a few.
Right. I always enjoy finding local examples of this broader.
Yeah.
I
think with our founding, the locus of power was already held within the hands of a few, these wealthy landowning people. Elected representatives tended to be that. Yeah. And the Republican movement, and the Republican movement has been to expand that and continue to expand that and continue to expand that. And the interesting and paradoxical and frustrating reality is that the Republican movement, its current champions, flawed as they are the liberals, the Democratic Party, and its
Mm-hmm.
opposition is now the Republican Party that used to be the champion of that movement. And it really
Yeah.
that really started when Republicans aligned themselves with big business at the end of the 19th century, and then
Right.
really came into full force when they decided to adopt the Southern strategy and welcome these Southern Democrat segregationists into the party. And
Wasn't there also, didn't I didn't mean to interrupt, but
go ahead. No, go ahead.
didn't Bill Clinton shift the Democratic Party fairly significantly? There was the DNC, and then it became the DLC, and there was
What?
kind of
Well,
a
I'd have to do some research into that, but what I can say happened during the Clinton era is the
mhm,
Democratic Party fully participated in the reactionary push to disenfranchise certain voters.
yeah.
And that was part of the big tough on crime era where we were continuing full steam into mass incarceration. So if you remember the term super predator and all of this,
Right.
the
Right.
the drug
Right.
war and all of that kind of stuff, we already know that the drug war was created to disenfranchise black voters. That was explicitly stated by the people in government in the Republican Party who created the drug war. They knew what
Mhm.
it was for. And the Democrats participated in and were complicit in that in the 90s. And we have our mass incarceration rates in part because of legislation created by Democrats, including Joe Biden, who wrote some of it. So we have to acknowledge that. We're not gonna we're not gonna play partisan politics here and say we're gonna be only promoting the Democrats and only castigating Republicans. We have to recognize that these parties have played significant roles in the history of our nation, both for good and ill. And not only in their ancient history, we can celebrate the Republican Party for its work in abolition and all of the stuff that it
Mhm.
did in the 19th century in
Right.
favor of enfranchisement of voters. We can also criticize them for their complicity in the Indian Wars and the expansion of the Manifest Destiny in the West. Um, and we can also celebrate the Democratic Party for its efforts to enact civil rights legislation in the 1960s and its continued efforts to expand in voter enfranchisement and democracy. But we can also criticize them for their allegiance to big business as well and their capitulation to that and the corruption of money in politics, which we've seen in our own state with Shemaiah Fagan, our Secretary of
Oh,
State.
yeah. Right.
So we
I
have to be honest about this kind of stuff, and we're going to be we're not going to play this game where Republicans good, Democrats bad, or Democrats good, Republicans bad. That's not what we're about. We're about making sure that our audience is getting the
is
truth
informed.
and is being informed by a pro democracy, by a movement that's interested in expanding power to the common people, to the public, and that's what it means to be pro democracy for us. So
Equality and justice for all.
yeah,
So to me, if you just look historically and statistically, empirically, um, both parties in their various iterations have presided over what has become this phenomenal wealth gap, so
mm-hmm.
that 2% of the planet own, I don't know, 98% of all the wealth. And they've presided over the environmental decline of our, certainly in our country. These figures have probably changed because they're 3 or 4 years old now. But I mean, I don't know if people know, but only that 40% of America's waterways do not or barely support aquatic life as a consequence of,
Yeah, I imagine that will continue to diminish.
and they, I remember when 350.org got started, and I thought that's an awkward name because eventually it's going to be outdated, because we're already at 410 parts per million or something
Mm-hmm.
billion, whatever
Yeah,
that was.
so we can recognize, without getting too far off topic, we can recognize that liberalism and republicanism, which are very new in global
Right.
history. In Europe, we didn't see the end of monarchialism till the First World War. And when monarchialism collapsed, it didn't all immediately become republicanism. We saw varieties of different kinds of governments formed. We saw a kind of republicanism over in the Soviet Union, the Soviet system, which was Republican, but it was also communist, and it vacillated between republicanism and authoritarianism. We also
Right.
saw authoritarian governments in fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, and we saw so the end of monarchialism saw this explosion of different experiments in how to create government systems and structures. And it's been in the last few decades that Europe has swung towards Republican models of government. And and so that there's only a few monarchies left in Europe. And we're still now the new struggle is the reactionaries who lost the monarchy are now trying to push Republican states into authoritarianism. So you see that in Hungary, for example. And we're seeing that, of course, in this country, this reactionary movement to try to move us towards authoritarianism. And so and again, with that false dichotomy, the end game is of this false dichotomy is minority rule by a party whose political opposition is through a variety of political mechanisms disenfranchised and denied fair representation. So the idea of saying that we are not a democracy, we are a constitutional republic, rather than recognizing that we are both and you need both for our society to function, is the end of our republic. So by saying that we are a constitutional republic, that effort is actually leading to the end of our republic, because what will happen is the locus of power shifts away from the public into the hands of a single political party and its leaders. And then once the locus of power is no longer with the public, we're no longer a republic. We're an authoritarian system with a dominant political party, likely a fascist party. So that's the risk, and that's the concern that we have and that we're facing here. But we can also, while recognizing that fascism is a risk, we can also look at liberalism and republicanism and see the kinds of problems that have been allowed to flourish here, like this environmental destruction, like the worst excesses of capitalism. And we can say, hey, we can actually critique liberalism. We can actually critique republicanism. We don't have to do it from a reactionary standpoint and push us towards authoritarianism and fascism. We don't have to do that. But we can still critique these things, and we can still look at ways of managing our republic such that market interests and powerful wealth interests don't have all of this power to run roughshod over the interests of the public and roughshod over the interests of nature itself and over our long-term prospects of global survival. So I do think that in a future episode we should take liberalism and republicanism to task and look at how we can critique that, because I think it's worth doing. So yeah, that's my thoughts on this this current situation of unsustainability that we're in. Is we are in a crisis, and liberalism is to blame in many respects for that.
Well, obviously, crises spur change. Not always good. It's sometimes a little knee jerk, but clearly 250 years with this two-party experiment. I think it's time to look at alternatives, and what that is, I don't know. I don't know whether it's a parliamentary system. I don't know whether it's a socialist system a la Sweden or the Netherlands or something, but our currency isn't working really for the working class. And
as long as we have this reactionary strain that's trying to limit the locus of power to the hands of a few, it's going to be really hard to have anything other than a two-party system in the way our country's structured, because you'll either have that movement and its party and its party, the party it manages, and then you'll have a counter movement that's trying to protect the broad base of power in our public. And if you break up that liberal movement, then the reactionaries take power and we become a fascist state. If you break up that fascist movement, which would be ideal, then you might be able to start to see this plurality of parties. But I don't see them doing that. I don't see them giving up that. They're actually trying to gain more and more people to ally themselves with that idea.
It seems that there's holding on to power is really important to both parties.
Yeah.
Democrats and Republicans, but
yeah,
I understand you need to jet early today.
I do have to go to lunch pretty soon here. I do think that I want to hear like more of your thoughts on this. I've got some more things to say. We could talk on this subject for great length.
Well, continue on. I was just concerned that you weren't keeping track of time.
One of the things, I'm keeping track of time. One of the things I think is important for us to know, we're pro-democracy. That means we want our broad base of power among our public. That means we want people voting. We're going to continue to push for people to vote. They don't have to think ideologically like us, because our overarching ideology is public enfranchisement. And what that means then is we can reach across political lines. Of course, we're opposed to reactionaries and the reactionary movement that's trying to restrict voting access. But I think that we can find common ground with this dwindling number of conservatives who are still ideologically committed to republicanism and the idea that all people are created equal and that all people should have rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Because, this reactionary movement that's starting to lay claim over the conservative movement and drive out traditional conservatives is something I think some of them are actually very concerned about, because reactionaries aren't conservatives. They're not at all. They're not interested in preserving the republic. They're interested in taking it over and turning it into an authoritarian state. And they will use the language of conservatism. They'll use the language of Christianity. They'll use any language they can to try to gain inroads and mainstream their ideas with people who would otherwise find them repugnant. So I think that we should definitely be reaching across the aisle to find these allies. And of course, we're gonna find it easier to find allies among the liberals and the leftists who want to stop reactionaries, but we have to recognize that we're also looking for allies among conservatives, and we have to recognize what conservatives' interests are. There are a lot of liberals, and I'm using liberal in the broad sense of the term, including conservatives. There's a lot of Republicans, little r Republicans in our country, because it's the dominant ideology in our country, that are concerned that if we swing too far to the left, they'll lose their property rights, and their interest and their fear, and the reason why they're conservative is about preserving property rights, which they consider important to their access to opportunity and liberty. And then on the left side of the spectrum, the reason why we have liberal Republicans is that those people are concerned about losing civil rights. So we have republicanism in this country, this broad ideology, and it's divided between liberal and conservative over these two different anxieties, these two different fears. On the conservative side, the fear of the loss of property rights. On the liberal side, the fear of the loss of civil rights. And those two fears have been leveraged against each other by the reactionaries. The reactionaries will make conservatives afraid of liberals, who they're going to say are going to try to take away your property rights. They're going to try to take your guns. They're going to try to take all these things. You need to stick with the reactionaries. And what you do is, if you stick with the reactionaries, you lose your republic, you lose your civil rights. On the other hand, the liberals are very concerned because they watch these reactionaries taking over the conservative movement and destroying civil rights. And they're very afraid of engaging with conservatives because they think all these conservatives are trying to destroy civil rights. There are real conservatives out there who are not trying to destroy civil rights. And if we could reach across the aisle, I think we could build a broader based movement to try to turn aside this growing reactionary movement. And I think that means we have to be open to conversation across the aisle with ideological opponents on the conservative,
Oh, sure.
liberal spectrum, recognizing that our real enemy, the real enemies of the republic, are these reactionaries who are trying to restrict access to power and trying to limit it into the hands of the partisan few who agree with
Right.
them and believe in these ideologies of supremacy. And that
Right.
means they're going to leverage everything they can. They're going to, and we see that growing movement of ideologies of supremacy. Men are better than women is what they think. They think that straight people are better than gay people. They think that cis people are better than trans people. They think Christians are better than non-Christians. They think that white people are better than people of color. And they're growing. They're using every possible inroad they can to try to get more people to join their movement without full awareness of what that movement entails and how it's going to destroy our republic. So I think that we should definitely be reaching out and trying to make contact with allies in the conservative movement.
Interestingly, I think as horrible as the January 6th thing was, I know people were like, I personally was just appalled, and I'm all for a revolution, but
Okay.
not that. But that was just revolting.
But it wasn't a revolution. It was
No, it was an effort to deny a democratic election.
It was a reactionary insurrection. It was an attempt to maintain minority rule and abrogate democracy, the will of the people.
But what came out of that was that we did find some Republicans, one of them rather surprising to me, which was Liz Cheney, but, and Adam Kinzinger, and these people that actually do still believe in democracy and that whole thing. And so it was heartening to see that. And in addition to that, there's a lot of people. Joe Walsh isn't really a favorite of mine, but he finally had to walk away from the Republican Party because it's shifted, or at least a lot of the Republican Party that we see in the news has shifted so far to this reactionary position. But we're seeing more and more Voices of Reason, Resolute Square, which is founded by a Republican, still a Republican.
Yeah.
I enjoy reading his stuff or their stuff. And so there are allies out there. We agree at least on some basic fundamentals. And
I think if the interest is in preserving the republic and preserving representative democracy and the enfranchisement of the broad public, we're going to find allies across the political spectrum, with the exception, of course, the far right, who aren't interested in that. I think when we start to criticize republicanism and start to criticize liberalism from a more radical perspective, we're going to start to lose those allies. Because when we start to look at the ways in which republicanism and liberalism has actually failed us as a civilization and a society, then we're going to start to see the people who are allied to these ideologies without critique are going to be less amenable to radical critique. But I don't think we're there yet. I think what we need to do is we need to try to preserve the public power and the freedom that we've managed to accumulate from this reactionary push towards fascism. And of course, we definitely need some significant economic reforms and reform to allow this planet to continue to be livable. And I do think that we need to be looking at radical changes to civilization and society. I think right now the big fight is against fascism. We're gonna have to find a broad base of allies before we can even consider radical critiques and possibly radical changes.
I agree with you there. As I mentioned earlier, I'm working on an essay on fascism since somebody's recently decided that I'm a fascist Nazi.
Which just simply doesn't make, from the political standpoint and the spectrum alignment that we're on, it just simply does not make sense. But of course, that's projection. That's an attempt to deflect from how
definite projection.
Yeah, it's an attempt to deflect from how accurately that label actually fits your critics. At least your critics from the right.
What's interesting, though, is that for the longest time, I didn't like using the word fascism. I've warmed up to it in the last few months, but I didn't care for it, really. But I do like using it in regard to this nationalism, Christian nationalism, religious fascism. It's starting to really resonate with me. And,
there's a term, Christofascism, that is often used to refer to Christian nationalists.
Yeah. So there you go. All right.
I'm putting on my shoes. I'm heading off to my lunch appointment. But it's been great chatting about this, and I went off on a whole lecture and everything like that, but I thoroughly enjoyed it.
I really appreciate the research you did for this program, and I'm sure everyone else appreciates it as well. And I want to thank my co-host, Israel, and this is me, Mary Geddry. Not really a Nazi fascist, but that's for another program.
Yeah, maybe next time we can get into the political spectrum a little bit more and talk about who these fascists are and why they exist at this period in history. It's a reaction against the Republican movement, and so we should definitely talk about fascism and how it functions.
Okay, all right. Thank you, everybody, and that is us saying ciao.
Thanks so much.